So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Today is International Women's Day. It was already mentioned. So it's an occasion to remember great women and great struggles for freedom, right? And equality like the one in Iran that is going on under the slogan Zan Zendegi Azadi, which means woman, freedom and liberty, right? And which is very close to my heart, right? I wish us that the energy on the global agenda for gender issues and the speed on the way to more gender equality can be increased. And our very modest input to this will be today our discussion on thematic or high-level priority budgeting with a focus on the gender, right? So I will give you a short introduction with some basics, also with a little bit from my own history with thematic budgeting. And then I will go into the logic of thematic or high-level priority budgeting, then apply this to the specific example of gender, right? And then I will conclude with a couple of conclusions. So my own experience reaches back to in the last 25 years. It started more or less with at the beginning of the 2000s when we did the reform of the budget documents in the Federal Ministry of Finance, where we looked at the environmental annex and the technology, science and technology. But it was more like bits and pieces, and it was not a whole strategy, right? Then came the budget law reform with the gender very prominently placed. And we did the implementation of the impact assessment. But I got more into the issue with my work for the International Monetary Fund, which was from 2011, right? But it was when I was working in the Ministry of Finance. I was in Ministry of Finance from 1998 to 2015, just with a short break in Salzburg. And I did missions like, instead of going on holidays, I went on IMF missions, man. And then from 16 to 18, I was in the federal state of Styria. I was a budget director and the head of the finance division. And then I took a break to think about what I did those last 20 years, right? And I tried to understand what I did as a bureaucrat in the bureaucracies, right? It was very puzzling for me to see, to learn a little bit more of the literature. And I did not find the enthusiasm that I had for my work in the bureaucracy. I did not find it all in the literature. So I digged a little bit further. And this led me then to my PhD, which I enrolled in 2021 with Paul Duguay at the University of London Royal Holloway and Pedro Montero. They cannot join today because Pedro is in California, so he's sleeping right now, and Paul has other obligations. But for me, that's a real thrilling experience, right? It's a very theoretical work, right? I'm going back to Max Weber and developing, based on a novel reading of Weber, I'm developing a vocabulary to discuss contemporary bureaucratic phenomena, right? And I will come back to this a little bit when we talk about the logic of thematic budgeting. So I have to say I've learned a lot with the International Monetary Fund, but all that I'm saying here are my opinions, as well as all accuracies and possible mistakes that can happen in a talk of 30 minutes. My responsibility, right? So I'm doing a little bit of work also for the Overseas Development Institute project on thematic budgeting. And it's this switching between the research and the experts, which gives me a little bit of bureaucratic air of breathing a little bit bureaucratic air, which helps me then return back to my research desk and have intensive stints of research and then of experts' work. What I want to do today is I want to give you really a perspective on thematic budgeting or high-level priority budgeting, define it, show you some international examples, but more specifically focus on its logic, right? And to show what this logic implies for the specific field of gender budgeting, right? So let's move on. What is thematic or high-level priority budgeting, right? Well, I mean, it's a generic notion for approaches using PFM tools to focus on policy priorities like gender equality or climate change or SDG spending. There's not really a widely accepted definition, right? Everybody knows what is meant by it, but there's not really a very widely accepted definition of the thematic budgeting, right? There is one definition that comes more from the NGO side, which is that it's a tool to give citizens, communities, and other organizations more insight in budget processes and engenders a dialogue between the authorities and organizations, etc. Right? This is one take. The IMF terminology is budgeting for high-level priorities, right? It's not thematic budgeting, but budgeting for high-level priorities or priority-based budgeting. Well, the latter term could be a little bit misleading because there is a literature on priority-based budgeting which has nothing to do with what we are really talking about. But budgeting for high-level priorities, I think this is a very precise definition, right? So, and then it's chosen strategic priority or set of strategic priorities, the preparation of the budget and highlights them at key stages of the budget cycle, right? And then mentions green, climate budgeting, gender responsive, or SDG budgeting, right? Sustainable Development Goals budgeting, which is also on the rise. If there is an El Dorado for thematic budgeting, it would be in Latin America, right? So in Latin America, it's very evolved, right? You have the themes and priorities in Argentina: gender, children and adolescents, care for people with disabilities, environmental issues. In Guatemala, you have indigenous people, security, justice, education, reducing malnutrition, water resources, sanitation, etc. So it's a very elaborate. In Mexico, you have a very nice, transparent kind of data warehouse where you can download all the information, etc. Right. So this is perhaps the region where it is most practiced. Right? But let's come to the logic, right? What is the logic of thematic or high-level priority budgeting? And here I come to my research, my understanding of bureaucracy as doing order, right? And I'm going back to Weber's basic vocabulary of economy and society, which is the Grundbegriffe, and I do not focus as much as the whole post-Weber discussion on the ideal type of his sociology of rule. And there he defines a Verband, which is sometimes translated as organization, but this is very misleading because a Verband reaches from a family to the state in its entirety, right? Is a relationship if the observance of its order is guaranteed by the behavior of particular persons charged specifically with its implementation, such as director, the Leiter, and quite possibly an administrative staff. So you would not have in a family an administrative staff, but you would have it in the state, right? And this is my hunch. If you want, I define bureaucratic activities as those activities which aim at implementing an order, right? And now I develop a vocabulary with two types of activities: judging and rulemaking, which are interpretative, and I link it to practice theoretical vocabulary of Theodor Schatzky. We will not go into that very deeply. We will stick with the public budgeting, right? And public budgeting is about allocating scarce resources according to political objectives, right? Something like that. And the order, have to let someone in. The order that is implemented is legislative as well as administrative rules and practices of the entity, right? Including those governing the budget cycle, right? So you have, and we will mostly discuss the rule-making side when we talk about gender budgeting. It's about rules that you change, that you introduce, etc. So I have to bring in another piece of Weber methodology, which are ideal types. Right? And an ideal type is grounded in empirical reality, but focuses on specific features of this empirical reality, right? Abstracting from all others, and a specific point. Weber has a lot of different ideal types, and there's a lot of discussion on how they hang together. But for him, the rationality plays a certain primordial role. And for you to understand best what is an ideal type, you think of an economic model. An economic model would be an ideal type. Weber has then a lot of other ideal types, but an economic model is a very nice example of ideal types now. And my point of departure for discussing the logic is that an ideal type budget office's objective is to avoid waste, right? Is to spend efficiently. If it would not choose ceteris paribus, the less expensive to the more expensive, it would not behave like a budget, like a bureaucratic institution, right? So if we can agree on that, suppose that we have a utility function, right, with a budget classification as its arguments, so elements X, that reflect activities to be financed by the budget, and that assigns a utility value to each of those. Right? Then you have the budget constraint, the well-known budget constraint. I have to say that none of this is about a mathematical argument, right? It's just facilitate the notation and to facilitate the understanding. So suppose that the utility function is well behaved, then the optimization problem is given maximum utility subject to the budget constraint, right? And the well-known optimality condition is that marginal utility is the same over all arguments in the utility function, right? If this was not the case, you could reallocate and increase overall utility. So this is, I mean, we are here in the institution of economists, right? This would be the economist solution, the welfare theoretical solution to budgeting is with an all-knowing social planner, he would just put the budget like this with the utilities, with marginal utilities equal across all users. But that would assume a way and would abstract. In this model, there are no bureaucrats, there are no rules, etc., etc. So where the welfare theoretic solution comes to an end, the bureaucracy theoretic solution begins, right? Because given that the central budget office does not have full information, line ministries behave strategically, the problem of budgeting from a bureaucracy theory point of view becomes, what are the rules and practices that need to be in place such as to come as close as possible to the optimality condition. Right? So the optimality condition will never really be implemented, but you can, by finding rules and thinking a little bit about it, it will have to be rules of, it will have to be an exchange of information between line ministries and the central budget office, right? And it will have to be rules of disclosure, budget transparency, budget process rules, budgeting and budget implementation rules, etc. Right? But also hiring rules for the budget office, etc., etc. So it's a whole ecology of rules, right? that need to be considered, right? And it's like Schrauben an denen man dreht, right? So this is the central budget office's problem, right? And now we move to the thematic budgeting. So what then is the priority budgeting? It adds a dimension to this by taking explicitly the priority, like for example, gender equality or climate change, into account, such that suppose that you have a utility function where X1 is taken into account, priority P, and X2 is not. Then thematic high-level priority budgeting means that if the derivative of marginal utility with respect to the priority is positive for X1 and 0 for X2, and ceteris paribus, the more the priority P is taken into account, the higher is X1 over X2. That's logic, right? Because the optimality condition is the equality of the marginal utilities. So taking into account more P gives you a higher marginal utility, which with decreasing marginal utility, right, with a higher allocation of X1, you will get the equality, and with a fixed budget, this will be at the expense of X2 and other arguments, right? So this is the formulation in mathematical terms, right? But the question is, what do you require in terms of rules, of processes and practices to do this, to do thematic budgeting, right? To take into account the priority, right? And so it requires a methodology to determine to what extent priority P is taken into account. It requires that the participants in the budget process know the methodology. It requires new rules and practices implementing the methodology, adjusting the budget process, adjusting the budget circular, adjusting the reporting process, etc., etc. So there is a whole range of things. And the bureaucracy theory question becomes, how need those rules to be shaped? We're speaking not just of one rule, but the whole rule ecology, right? Meaning that those rules are also interlinked, right? Such that we get as close as possible to the optimality condition, which takes into account the priority, right? And we will look at gender budgeting to give a little bit more practice to this and to make it a little bit more clear, right? So what is gender budgeting? It's thematic budgeting in the field of gender equality. And the basic idea is that of gender mainstreaming, right? And I will not go into this. I think everybody knows, right? It's just gender perspective is to be incorporated in all policies at all levels and at all stages by the actors involved in the policy making. This is a Council of Europe definition, right? So that you take into account the gender perspective at all levels, at all stages, right? So gender budgeting is then the application of gender mainstreaming in the domain of public budgeting, or framed more specifically, it's integrating a clear gender perspective with the overall context of the budget process through special processes and analytical tools, etc., or an IMF definition, an approach that uses fiscal policy and public financial management instruments to promote gender equality and girls' and women's development. But thinking back to the last slide on the logics part, right, about the rules, right? What are the tools? And here the tools are equivalent to the two rules, right? It's so a gender statement is a kind of a rule that you have to do, and et cetera, and then comes somebody who defines what will be the chapters, et cetera. And all this, I understand these rules, right? So you have to have a legal framework, you have to fit it into the legal framework, into the institutional framework, you have to have gender disaggregated statistics, you have to have links to national plans, SDGs, you have to embed it with medium-term budget framework, you have to have a gender statement where you show the results, right? Where you present together with the budget, you present the gender-sensitive budget allocations, the objectives, etc., etc. Have the ex-ante gender impact assessment, budget circulars, you have to have a classification, a tagging of identifying gender-sensitive spending. You have to have a gender lens on budget execution reports, on ex post impact assessment, etc. So there are a whole set of rules that you need in order to do what we said is gender budgeting in the logic section, right? Which is just to take into account the priority P such that finding those rules such that you approach the optimality conditions as far as possible. And here I've made a little green arrow which shows those tools and rules where gender marking is needed or helpful, right? And gender marking is this specific technique where you determine the gender sensitivity of spending, right? And I want to go into more detail in this specific technique, right? To give you a little bit of a flavor of what it is in practice that you are doing when you're doing gender budgeting. So we focus on gender markers, which are not directly built into budget classification, but allow to highlight specific features of selected expenditures, right? It's kind of also flags, right? In an IT system, you say, okay, you have this indication has a flag and the next, etc. And the gender budget markers does this in the field of inequality. And so you have different methodologies, right? But all methodologies, and this is not just for gender, it's also for the green, etc., and for other. The basic motivation is that you separate between direct expenditure, which is expenditure that targets gender equality or climate, and indirect one, right? An indirect one is that which takes into account gender equality issues, but is not targeting. So a direct example would be a MINT program for girls, right? And an indirect would be, I don't know, a big energy project which takes into account gender equality considerations, which has an envelope, which has activities, etc. So there are different ways to deal with this indirect category, right? The direct category is relatively straightforward. You just imagine you base your analysis on a kind of program classification. Then you look, okay, is this program focusing on gender equality or not, etc. But the indirect one is more difficult. So you have either you develop a concept of mainstream expenditure, or you do weighing of the beneficiaries. Right? I brought you the example of India, which is quite famous, which does gender budgeting since 2006 or 2007, and applies this weighing approach. A further design variable is the link to strategic objectives. Right? Is the marking linked to strategic objectives, or is it not? And with those variables, I can more or less classify systems of gender marking methodologies nearly all over the world. I wanted to bring you an example for this concept of mainstreamed expenditure with the OECD gender marker, which is perhaps the eldest of the gender marking methodologies, which has three scores and criteria for classifying, right? You have score 2, that is the direct expenditure, and then you have different criteria, like you have to have gender analysis, you have to have objectives, etc., right? And the same goes for indirect expenditure, which is score 1, where you have criteria for doing the classification. And you have different systems. I mean, the UN system is very much based on this, with an additional category, which is below, which is between 0 and 1. And you have an example like in the Philippines, you have a system where you have points that you give for projects, etc., to capture this gender mainstreaming. Is the expenditure mainstreamed or not? I have one example that I brought this from Togo, where I was involved, which made some kind of ambitious budget reforms and started gender budgeting. And there we have made 2 gender marking exercises where we adapted the OECD methodology for a country that does not have a lot of gender sensitive expenditure, right? So we took program classification, program action, project activity, right? And on the activity level, we were less demanding than on the project level. So to allow that really all activities can be shown that have a gender relevance, right? But for the medium to long term, to approach OECD criteria with gender analysis, etc., to have the quality in the medium term, because clearly this is the stream goes towards the development goes towards developing concepts for mainstream expenditure and very much focus on the quality of the expenditure, right? And to have quite elaborate institutional processes. There is a famous example is Andalusia, where you have a very elaborate quality assurance process, etc., etc. So I have to stay within the 30 minutes because I'm staying with the budget, because I'm a budget bureaucrat, so I don't want to go over the budget. What does this imply for? What does the thematic budgeting imply for the PFM more generally, right? And I tend to think of it in terms of the concept of budget dimensions, right? And what I mean by this is, in the same way that I tried to make the argument from the logics, from the objectives, from the political objectives, from the objectives of the budget office, to rules and rationalities in the realm of thematic budgeting, you can do the same thing for other budget dimensions, right? You can do it for performance dimension, you can do it for the temporal dimension, right? So a budget has, you have the annual budget, you have the medium-term budget, you have long-term budget, you do spending reviews, you do it for the fiscal risk dimension, which is very much in discussion right now, right? And you do it for the thematic dimension, right? And if you have a little bit of time and you go to the library of the Ministry of Finance and you look at the budget 1818, for example, right? Or in the first half of the 19th century, and you compare it to 2018, what you see is a very different document, right? One is handwritten, the other is I don't know how many kilo, right? So, but the basic thing is that you have a lot of more different dimensions that you have in budgeting today than you had 200 years ago. And you can see by this a little bit what Weber called the rationalization, because the budgeting, the basic objective of budgeting has not changed so dramatically, but the order has changed dramatically. And then those dimensions. And this is not just something, it's not just a technical thing, right? This goes much deeper into the processes, even into the understanding of the people doing the work, right? And here is really a new approach to budgeting, which can be seen, which is finance ministries and specifically budget DGs all over the world are in a process of transformation, from a very operational kind of organizing the financing way of doing it, doing accounting, etc., to an analytic and strategic expert organization, right? And Richard Allen and colleagues have analyzed this and have proposed two different models. And this is already my last slide, where he has a traditional model, right, which is has a segmentalist culture, and it's very close, introspective, not very transparent, very hermetically closed to the outside world. Inward-looking, with a centralized control environment, a narrow strategic perspective, very process-oriented. And then he has the emerging model, kind of ideal type, right? which is the opposite, very integrative culture, open, communicative, consultative, outward-looking, decentralized control environment, broad strategic perspective, policy-oriented, with an integrated financial information management system, right? So when I came to the budget DG in the Federal Ministry of Finance in 98, it was very much on this traditional side, right? And when I left in 2015, a long way has been done, and you can more or less classify all budget departments all over the world that I'm in touch with on this continuum, right? And what I find so fascinating is that, and here I come back to my scholarly work, is that if you have appropriate conceptual tools and models, right, you can see this process really unfolding before your eyes, right? And that's why I'm doing this research. That's why I'm doing this research. Thanks very much. I was not exactly in the 30 minutes, but I was very close. I think.
No problem, because
thanks.
I make it very You can have to go there. Okay. Camera. Can I sit here?
You can sit here.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to provide a brief commentary today, particularly, of course, on International Women's Day. I make it rather brief and would just like to add a bit from the Austrian perspective. First of all, Clemens, thanks a lot for this presentation on what I think is a very important topic and movement worldwide. Priority budgeting, thematic budgeting has been promoted by the international institution, as you said before, by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the OECD, by the European Commission for quite a long time now. And these institutions keep issuing recommendations, guidance, and also international examples and international best practices for priority or thematic budgeting. You also mentioned that these approaches are not new. Gender budgeting is you may call it the pioneer of thematic budgeting, is over a quarter of a century old in the meantime. And it's only rather recently that this pioneer has been followed by green budgeting, by sustainable development goals budgeting, which are implemented mostly, and I think this is an issue that should be taken care of, mostly as parallel processes which are independent of each other. Also in Austria, these approaches, which are aiming at the mainstreaming of high-level priorities into the budgetary process and into a budget, public budgets, have been implemented, albeit to a different degree or to a different extent. Austria is on the forefront somewhat in some aspects, particularly regarding gender budgeting. At least legally and institutionally, there is a rather strong basis for gender budgeting in Austria. It's anchored in the constitution, and it's an integral part of the performance-oriented or informed budgeting at the federal level since 2013. However, the implementation of gender budgeting, the actual implementation, unfortunately, is less strong compared to the strong legal and institutional foundation. There is no overarching gender equality strategy based on overarching gender equality goals. The coordination across line ministries could be strengthened regarding the gender equality goals, regarding the indicators, regarding gender equality measures, because it's obvious that many or most, I may say all, gender gaps are the result of a lot of different factors and need a broad-based policy mix that cannot be limited to one single or one individual ministry. The gender assessment of new programs, of new measures, of new laws, which is obligatory actually. In some cases, it's rather superficially, sometimes it's missing at all, as well as the ex post evaluations, which also are obligatory actually. There is a focus on expenditures, as in your examples, while revenues and particularly taxes get far less attention. And as in many other policy areas in Austria, one has to say that there is no multi-level coordinated approach across the subnational levels, which, if at all, pursue their own individual approaches and methodologies. More recently, Austria, and I think that's a very interesting and a very important movement, has made first steps in the implementation of green budgeting. It has committed to conduct green spending reviews as one element of the reforms included in the National Resilience and Recovery Plan. And within these, a green budgeting method has been established using these markers, green tagging, which you showed us for gender budgeting. And within the first exercise, climate productive expenditures were identified in the federal budget. It's intended to expand this green budgeting method, this green budgeting approach to climate harmful spending and subsidies, to revenues and taxes, etc. Why is that? I said before that these priority budgeting or thematic budgeting approaches, in my opinion, are a very important development. Why is that so? The OECD and actually all the other international institutions point out a few advantages or benefits that these budgeting approaches have. One is you have an improved evidence base upon which resource allocation decisions can be made. Another one is that the effectiveness of the budget to achieve high priority goals at least can be approached. And you also have greater transparency within budgeting and public budgets, the budget process, etc. However, there are also various challenges, I might call them, and some of them I have already illustrated at the Austrian example. One is that these approaches need to be linked to an overarching strategy. For example, climate goals and a climate strategy, or gender equality goals and an overarching gender equality strategy. The Austrian gender budgeting, right from the beginning, has been suffering from the lack of a gender equality strategy. You also need a comprehensive database or comprehensive databases. The Austrian green budgeting approaches, the first steps are suffering from the lack of data, particularly for subnational governments. You need expertise in the line ministries, as well as obviously resources. In the Austrian federal administration, there is often a lack of both. Another challenge is the integration, I mentioned that before already, of various priorities. For example, gender budgeting, green budgeting, which currently are separate strands and processes in practice. Also in Austria, there is no connection at all between the gender budgeting on the one hand and between the green budgeting on the other hand. There is also the question how you deal with conflicting goals and trade-offs in relation to other issues, which are no explicit priority themes, but also across different priority issues. And a particular challenge for federal states, of course, is how do you achieve a coordinated implementation of priority budgeting across the federal levels and at the subnational levels between the jurisdictions, between the Bundesländer, for example, or between the municipalities. And I'm really curious to hear your opinion against the background of your international experience, whether there are countries that can be regarded as best practices in these regarding these challenges, or which are better able to cope with these challenges that Austria does currently. Thank you.
No, thanks very much. These are all very relevant points. I would say okay, gender and overall gender strategy would be important, right? What I think is closer to the gender budgeting is really the integration of it in the budget process. Not just doing reporting, but really integrating it in the budget process so that it is a relevant issue for the allocation process, right? And that's always when we're working, I don't know, on a gender report in a country, right? That is often, it's as if this was the goal, right? And here is the gender report, and now we have achieved our goal, etc. But this is just one piece, right? It's a piece in a lot of pieces that need to be in place in order to do the budgeting. Well, you have to start somewhere, right? And you cannot do everything at the same time, and you have to build up this because it's much more demanding than it might seem at first sight, right? So you have to begin somewhere. As to the coordination between the different levels of government, I mean, I think this is not a gender relevant. It's not a gender specific point or climate specific point. It's just the way that different levels of government work together, right? And we have the experience of the budget law, etc., etc. So I would say I would not. I mean, if there are common approaches, that would be welcome, and it's certainly up to the federal level to propose this. But I think that advances in the own jurisdictions would be, I think, would be more important to really also show something, to showcase, and also to communicate it down on the political level, etc. And it's a little bit here that I don't see. I mean, there is something going on in the green, right? The climate, but given that you have a gender budgeting in the constitution, I would link the green tagging with the gender tagging, right? I mean, it's a very close methodology. Perhaps in the green, you have better arguments to have a score for climate climate nuisances, right? For bad spending, right? Which is more difficult in the gender methodology. But otherwise, this could be one system where you have different teams, like you have it in Mexico and many other countries, right? So there's certainly room to propose methodologies that can be scaled up to other themes, and that could be pursued at the various different levels. Right? I mean, there are things going on. You have Indiana something, you have Asturia a little bit something, but I mean, it could be much more clearly.
Okay, so I think we can open the floor. I'll just stop sharing the screen so we can see all the questions from the audience. Does anybody have questions? Hans.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I wonder if I got that right. What you were presenting is just the first step, that is providing information about, let's say, gender issues or green issues or whatever. For example, having these markers on certain budget positions and all this stuff. So the next step, or the more important step, would be how does that impact on the allocation of funds to different goals and all this stuff. If I got that right, there is no clear example all over the world who really do that in a sense that we have a real performance budgeting, not just performance or whatever informed budgeting or something like that. But I'd like to ask you a very simple question, I guess. Who uses this information? Does that have an impact on parliamentary debates? Do you have any information on this? Or is it just, okay, instead of 200 pages of budget documents, we now have 2,000 pages, which also include information on gender issues, on green issues, but who's using this information, and do they use it, parliamentaries or whoever, and do they use it in a very constructive sense, or just take it, okay, that's more information, I don't need that?
Okay, so should I?
Yeah.
Oh, it would be misunderstood if I say it does not exist anywhere in the world. There are systems where you have it integrated in the budget process. You have Canada, for example, is a very good example. They do it with a lot of administrative capacity and with a high level priority from the government, right? So in African examples are, for example, Rwanda, right? But also in Togo, it is a high level priority theme, right? And they have in the budget process, they have specific allocations that go to the gender, etc., etc. So it's a little bit the perspective that you're producing a lot of reports and nobody cares about it would not be the right. I mean that if that happens, then this is very unfortunate, because this is very inefficient. Because in the end, what counts is that you factor it in the budget process and you create this awareness, etc., etc. So I think that it's a little bit too pessimistic to say it's just producing reports. Right? I would even say that a report that is too long and too difficult to read, etc., or is not read, is a dead instrument, right? And should be abolished or rationalized, etc., etc. So I guess this is important in the perspective, and that's why I put a lot of emphasis on the logic, right? But because the logic is that you factor it in the budget process. And the logic then is that you have an eye on the quality of the spending, so that on the ground something is moving. What I just wanted to show is that you need a lot of kind of rules and bureaucracy so that this can function. And
Thomas, and then.
Yeah, I want to continue on the question by Hans. Do voters care about the top priorities? Would be an interesting question. I want to ask you to comment on this, because I have the feeling that voters care more about the provision of public goods. Is the amount of public goods sufficiently big? Is the quality sufficiently high? And things like this. Do voters care about top priorities? And then, if I memorize your top priorities that you have mentioned in your presentation, there are some environmental issues, green priorities, there are gender priorities, you mentioned technology priorities, whatever those are. Is there a danger of having an inflation of priorities, so that we have lots of priorities and we don't see the wood out of the trees or so? That would be another question. And then I want to ask you about the concept of the utility function, because you are defining a utility function over the budget items. And so you have derivations of the utility towards each budget item. If I remember welfare economics correctly, you would have a general welfare function with individual utilities as the elements of the welfare function, rather than budget items. And you would take derivatives with respect to the individual utility, and the individual utility with respect to the public good or whatever it is. Yeah. How can you relate this concept of your utility function with a general welfare function that we know from welfare economics?
Okay. So do voters care? I mean, that's a difficult question, right? I mean, you know that, for example, different parties have different positions on this, right? And then this will be reflected in voting results, etc. I mean, then this would be a question for a political scientist, right? For me, as a bureaucrat, I see it in my order, right? I see gender budgeting in the constitution, right? And this, for me, is if I'm a bureaucrat in a ministry in a country that has gender budgeting in the constitution, I will say, okay, this is a call on me to propose something for gender equality, right? This is my take on as a bureaucrat, right? This is my bureaucratic perspective, if you want, right? So if green or if technology is or I don't know, elderly people or indigenous people, right? Then I would be called to work on this. Right? So this is very down to earth, right? But this brings me to, can there be too many priorities? I mean, not everything can be a priority, right? And you have if you have priorities, then you also have posteriorities, right? Not everything can be on the same level, and there is this danger that the system cannot absorb that many priorities. And if you look, for example, in the Latin American countries, they don't treat each of the themes in the same way, right, and in the same depth. So there are differences, right? There are also subjects that are more suitable, where you have more this cross-cutting aspect, which is in the mainstreaming idea, right? And where it is important that that you take into account this cross-cutting issue. So I would say I would rather begin with those issues and then it's not a welfare function, right? And the utility function that is just a shortcut, right, for the budget bureaucrat, right? That says, okay, I have those allocations, right, and there is in a sense a utility attached to my spending, right, which relates to the order, right, and so I don't need the utility function at all, right. What I need is that there is some kind of interpretative mechanism that I can analyze my order and gain information on it. I mean, I don't want to become too technical, but you can also take some kind of Dworkinian charge, right, that interprets the legal system and comes up with quite clear answers, right? Or you could take a practice theoretical view and say you have an interpretative community that interprets the order and comes up with a certain preference on different spending alternatives, which can approximate the utility function. So we're not speaking about welfare economics. The welfare economics was just the way to communicate the idea, right? The idea is that under idealized circumstances, I can say this project is more in line with my overall order than that project, right? This is the baseline. And the baseline is that you have a central unit that covers the whole, and you have individualized units like the line ministries that just cover pieces, right? But they have the information, and at the center you have the whole picture, but you're lacking information. And that's why you are in the business of exchanging information. So
okay.
Yeah.
I just have to look at the time. We have one more question on the floor, and I think it's the last question because we are already running out of time. So please go ahead.
In business and in marketing, we observe something like greenwashing and pinkwashing. So would this also be a problem here? For example, that we go into the budget, restructure our packages in such a way that I add a little bit of a pink or a green component, and then in the end I can present to the voter, well, I have so many more millions in my pink or my green department than before. Would this be, in practical terms, also a problem here?
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because basically when you are engaged in an exercise, in a marking exercise, you will discuss with the counterparts from the line ministries, and they want to have everything marked, right? They want to have everything gender sensitive, right? So you need to have in place a very good quality assurance, right? So that this doesn't happen, because what you don't want to have is that everything is gender sensitive, but nothing changes in the on the ground, right? So this is a huge challenge, but there are means and ways to address it on the institutional side, and to have organizations challenging the marking, etc., etc. But it's very important because it's a quantitative approach with the benefits of the quantitative approach, but it makes no sense if everything is green and everything is pink. That's clear.
Okay, so we see that Good House Law is also working in gender budgeting, so we have to be careful with our targets and the measures. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and have a good afternoon.